If you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
This is another of our popular Listener's Choice interviews, which we're playing over the weekend. We've chosen the most popular interviews for you to select the Listener's Choice winner. If you're not sure how the Listener's Choice competition works, have a look at horsechats.com/choice for the rules and the leaderboard. Our guest today is Diana Waters. If you think you've heard Diana's voice before, when she starts talking, you're probably right. She was a guest on 016. So if you'd like to hear about her favourite quote, how she started with horses, her career with horses, and lots of other information, just go back to that episode, listen to that first, and then we can go on and listen to this episode. So how are you today, Diana?
I'm fine, thanks, Glenys. How are you?
Good. Diana, you're going to talk about the 10 ways to improve your riding, a biomechanical approach. What started you off with that idea? Why are you talking about that today, and what do you think it's got for the horse world? Why does the horse world need to know about this?
Okay. Well, my ultimate aim is to help horses and riders to be beautiful to watch, and also for the experience to be very enjoyable for the horse and rider. And those two ideas are quite linked, I think. And for that to happen, I believe that the horse and rider have to be perfectly synchronized with each other, which enables the aids to be precisely applied, and it also enables the rider to look very elegant and not to block the movement of the horse, so that the horse can express themselves and move to their full potential.
I'm thinking, as soon as you said it's got to be beautiful to watch, of course the horse has got to be enjoying it, because if the horse wasn't enjoying it, it wouldn't be beautiful, for someone looking at it.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, yep. All right, so we're going to start off with the first point, and we'll go through these points one by one. How important is it to have a balanced position at the halt? And tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's useful to begin with a halt just to make sure that everything's in alignment, because if the rider's not perfectly balanced, then they obviously won't be able to control their movement. So the balance in the halt, we're basically just looking at the basics. So the 3 straight lines, shoulder, hip, heel, down the rider's spine and down the horse's spine, and from the elbow down the arm to the bit, which most people know. A little bit of extra onto that, which I would look at, would be that the pelvis is neutral. So it's important that the pelvis isn't tilted back, which is where the rider would be sitting on their back pocket, and it's important that it's not tilted forward, so the rider is sitting on their fork. It needs to be neutral so that it can move both forward and backwards to absorb the movement of the horse. So that's what I'd be looking for in the halt.
Good. All right, so we're going then from the balanced position at the halt to absorbing the movement in the walk. So how does the position change as we go into walk?
Okay, so once the horse starts moving, it becomes about more than just position. It becomes about the rider being able to move in time with the horse or synchronize with the horse. So the horse's back moves in 2 halves, and therefore it's important that the rider's seat bones also move in 2 halves. So as the horse's hind leg steps under, the seat bone on that side moves forward, and then back again as the opposite side moves forward. So the seat bones need to move alternately, and the other thing that needs to happen is that the horse's belly will swing slightly left and right. So as the hind leg moves forward on the right, the belly will move to the left, and the rider's legs need to gently be able to follow that movement. And your aids also need to be in time with that movement as well. So, for example, if you're asking for a leg yield, you need to apply that leg aid as the belly swings away, which corresponds to the moment when that hind leg reaches forward. So in order to be able to apply those aids accurately, your seat bones need to be moving separately, and the legs need to be following the swing of the belly. Those are the main 2 things for absorbing the movement in the walk.
So when you're saying about the leg aids, it's not just then, if you want your horse to leg yield, to put the leg on, it's an on-off.
That's right. And the off is more important than the on, because it's the release which causes the lightness and the quick response from the horse, and which makes it clear to the horse what's expected. So, yeah, the timing of the application of the aid and the timing of the release are both extremely important.
Mm-hmm. So when you're saying the timing, and you'd already talked about the timing of the seat and the aids in aligning with, the horse's back and the belly, and then that becomes the sequence of legs. So it's still the timing within the sequence of legs as well, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. All right, so what sort of faults, we're going on to point number 3 now about correcting faults in the walk. What sort of faults are common faults that you see at the walk?
The most common faults I see are too much activity. So you will see a pushing seat and you'll see nagging legs. Now, the pushing seat is not as easy to correct as you might think, and I've put a lot of thought into doing this. And actually, most of my ideas have come from Heather Moffat and with help from other enlightened equitation teachers, but there's also some of my own observations added on. But in the walk, it's quite common for the rider to expect the walk to be too fast and to be constantly pushing to make the walk faster, which can cause the pushing seat and the nagging legs. But the pushing seat can also be caused if the seat bones aren't moving separately. So in other words, the rider's pushing both seat bones forward and back with every step instead of allowing one seat bone to go and then the other. It can be quite hard for the rider to separate the seat bones, particularly if their upper body is too far back or if their pelvis is not neutral. So it's quite common for people to sit on their back pockets or to be leaning just slightly too far back with the upper body. And what that means is that the pelvis, the lower back can't flex in and out correctly and the seat bones can't separate. So just those little adjustments of moving the upper body forward slightly, making sure the pelvis is neutral, can be enough to enable the rider to move the two seat bones separately, which then reduces that movement in the hips and it reduces the movement in the legs because the legs are then able to move separately as well and the aids are able to be applied with better timing. So this is where we use the equisimulator as well, because you can, when you have a rider that has the problem of the pushing seat, you can get them on the simulator and you can figure out what's causing that problem. And quite often, if I can just very gently guide the rider's back slightly forward and suddenly the problem disappears and they can see that in the mirror as well. And then they can get on their own horse and apply that to the horse. And it can be just a very small little adjustment that you're making. The other thing that can happen in the walk, if the rider is behind the movement, is that the head can nod, and that again is a symptom of not absorbing the movement correctly in the lower back. So that movement has to be absorbed somewhere, and often it ends up being absorbed in the head and neck instead.
Yep. And I'm just thinking, because some of these corrections you're giving are very subtle corrections, like to improve riding, there's nothing that beats those hours in the saddle, but surely it's got to be that at an early stage you've got to go to a coach that really can understand these subtle differences so that you're practicing the correct things instead of practicing the wrong things.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to teach beginners correctly, because it's a lot easier to teach something correctly from the start than to try and correct it once it's become quite an established habit. And I'm really interested in this. I spend a lot of time watching other people ride, obviously my own students, but also watching videos and trying to figure out what causes a specific problem. And I think very often it can be a very tiny change in body angle. And it's quite hard to see that when you're teaching a student on the ground on their horse. You're also trying to keep the horse going. But we've come up with this list with the help of the equisimulator also. I'll often submit a video in to some of my enlightened equitation colleagues in the UK. And often one of them will have had the same thing and figured it out. So we're really trying to build here a base of solutions to solve all the little problems that you get, which can actually escalate to bigger problems.
And that'll take us through now to absorbing movements in the sitting trot. So Diana, what have you got to say about absorbing the movement in the sitting trot? How can we help the riders to improve their riding using this biomechanical approach?
Okay, so the first important thing about the sitting trot is the horse, because we don't want to be trying to ride sitting trot on a horse that's not swinging correctly through the back. The horse needs to be strong enough and moving correctly. If the horse isn't moving correctly, then number one, the rider will get bounced around and they won't be able to absorb the movement. Also, it's going to be damaging for the horse to have the rider sitting on their back when they're not yet balanced. So once we've got the trot correct, we'll generally start off with just short periods of trot, especially with a novice rider. So we'll do walk, trot, walk transitions, which just enables them to maintain their balance and synchronization for short periods of time to begin with, and then you can gradually build on that. So the movement in the trot, the lower back flexes same as in the walk, but the flexion is a little bit greater. So the pelvis needs to be neutral. The seat bones move separately, the same as in the walk. So a little bit faster and a bigger movement than the walk. In order to enable the seat bones to move separately with the two halves of the horse's back, the rider needs to be sitting up fairly tall and not collapsing in their core. So a strong core, a relaxed lower back, and the two halves of the pelvis move separately in the sitting trot.
All right, good. And the thing that you said about riding correctly is dependent on the way the horse is going. It's very hard for a rider to sit to a trot where the horse is running on, head up, hollow backed. So to have the correct school horse, or to have, what can we do there to help improve the riders so they can learn to do sitting trot without having to worry about the way the horse is going? Or should they just focus on rising trot first until they can get the trot established? What do you think about that either way?
Well, that's an excellent question. We come across this a lot, teaching people on their own horses. It depends on the situation. Every situation is different. So obviously the ideal situation is that you would be on a schoolmaster who is well balanced when you learn a sitting trot. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. I have the X simulator, so I will commonly use that to teach the sitting trot, and that's an extremely useful tool. Some people, you can teach them sitting trot on their own horse, even if it's not highly trained. And again, that would be using the short periods of trot, especially if it's quite a small moving horse. It does the horse no harm to do a few steps, a jog type trot to begin with. The rider learns to sit that smaller movement, and then gradually they can learn to sit a larger movement. But if you have a horse that's very big moving and you don't have access to a schoolmaster, then I would generally be sticking to rising trot and working as much as we can in that. Because it's always got to be about the horse and the comfort of the horse. There's never a situation where it's good to have the rider bouncing around on the horse's back. Yeah. That doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. So I think you've pretty much covered that next bit about correcting the faults in the sitting trot. Is that right? We can move on to rising trot?
Well, I think there's a little bit more we can add to correcting the faults in the sitting trot.
Yeah, please.
So one of the common faults is that there's not enough movement in the rider's lower back. And this is generally caused, the same as for the walk, by the pelvis being tilted back onto the back pockets or the seat bones being fixed together. This causes the nodding head, which you'll see even in top-level riders sometimes. You'll see the head nodding, the upper body behind the movement, and sometimes the arms are bouncing as well. That's all caused by the seat bones being fixed together and not moving separately. It's harder to correct in the trot because everything happens a lot quicker and the movement's a lot bigger. Often, one of the big causes is to do with the upper body here. And another fault which is related to this is what we call the pelvic wiggle. So there's too much movement in the rider's midriff. So it looks as if the hips are pushing and shoving and the middle of the rider is wobbling about quite a lot. So the solution for all of these faults is the same, which is that the rider needs to learn to carry their upper body and to engage their core. And there's actually a really good trick which anybody can try for this, which I learned from Heather Moffat, and that's to wear a back support back to front. So, you know those back supports have a fairly rigid bit which goes around your back. I'm
trying to imagine it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if you turn that around so that the hard bit is in the front, every time you collapse, it digs into you. So it gives you that instant feedback every time you're collapsing your core. And that actually can fix all of these problems because once you're carrying yourself correctly, you're then not weighing down on your pelvis. So you can move the seat bones separately and you can move the lower back correctly. So that's a really good quick fix that anybody can try. I'm not a big one for big quick fixes in horses, but a quick fix in a rider I think can sometimes be very useful. I'll use that, the back support on a real horse or on the simulator as well.
I think that brings us to, having a position and being able to ride. It is important. You don't just sit there like a sack of potatoes, but it is important to have a strong core to be able to ride well.
It is, but it's very helpful to do things like Pilates and other exercises to help with that. But putting it into practice can be a lot harder. And that's why I think it's important to be able to break things down and to tell people exactly what they need to do, because you can say engage your core or sit up, but people aren't necessarily able to feel whether they are or aren't doing that.
Sure. Wait, can you hear anything? No? That's because we're waiting for someone with a good quality horse product to be advertised here. If that's you, then contact us, horsechats@horsechats.com, and we'll send you the details. Thanks. All right, we're going to move on to point number 6 now, which is absorbing movement in the rising trot.
Okay, so in the rising trots, the upper body needs to be inclined slightly forwards. The hips swing forward and back in a small arc. And the big one for me is that the head and the shoulders need to remain over the withers. They don't move relative to the horse. So if you see somebody really balanced in the rising trot, they'll appear to glide. If you look at their head and shoulders, they appear to glide along. They don't bounce up and down. They don't move forwards and backwards, but they glide along with the horse. And that's a real indication that the rider's balanced. In order for that to happen, the rider needs to be leaning slightly forward in the rise phase and a little bit more forward in the sit phase. And in the sit phase, the rider's pelvis also needs to be tilted slightly forward as opposed to neutral. And you're sitting softly with your pelvis tilted slightly forward, which enables you to keep your head and shoulders in that position over the front of the saddle, which makes you very light and easy for the horse to carry and very balanced and controlled in your rising.
All right, so that's about absorbing movement in the rising trot, but what sort of common faults would you see if we take us on to number 7 about correcting faults in the rising trot?
Okay. One of the most common faults is that the rider sits quite heavily into the back of the saddle, which compresses the horse's back with every sit phase. You can see this happening if you go and watch riders ride. If you see the saddle bouncing up with the rise and squashing down with the sit, you often see that to varying extents. That's caused by the rider falling behind the movement. And the rider falling behind the movement can be caused by the upper body being too upright, because a lot of people will say to sit up in the rising trot. It's caused by the legs being too far forward or gripping with the knees. It can be caused by rising too high, or it can be caused by trying to sit with the pelvis tilted too far back. So then that results in much too big a movement between the rise and the sit, and the rider ends up sitting in the back of the saddle. Another problem that we see is the rider is just slightly out of time with the trot, which results in a kind of double bounce. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yes, and actually everything you're saying, I'm picturing, so I hope that people listening are thinking about this, thinking about it, picturing it, drawing it if they need to, standing up, sitting, feeling it. So it's not just, I'll listen to this podcast and I'll come back to it, but go through and take advantage of it and either draw or sit, or except if you're driving, you'd better not do it. But, just as you're listening to it, start to think about each phase and start to think about what Diana's telling you, even if you're sitting down, if you can feel what's happening, and then taking that and using it to become a better rider and to improve coaching. Yeah,
hope to be able to make it fairly clear and not too complicated. It's easier when you're with the person, you can show them as well.
Sure,
but at least hopefully it'll get people thinking about, is what I'm feeling and seeing, is that right, or could it be improved? So with the double bounce that you see, this frustrated me for quite a long time, because I couldn't figure out why some people were doing it.
Yep.
They just couldn't seem to get the timing right. And then I discovered it's not necessarily about their timing, it's about their control. And the control, again, is related to the balance. And the absorption of the movement. So one cause of the double bounce is that the rider is just not balanced, which is usually caused by the legs being too far forward or the body being too far back, which means that when you sit, you can't control the speed of your sit. So you just fall down at whatever speed you happen to fall down, and then you're slightly out of time with the horse. Another problem which I recently discovered as well, which is very interesting, is that especially with a bigger trot, if the rider's knees and ankles are fixed, they can't actually absorb the stride in the up phase of the trot. So your knees and ankles need to flex a little bit when you're standing, especially in a bigger trot. If you trot in a 2-point position, or if you trot in a standing position, then your knees and ankles flex, don't they, to absorb that stride? And the same thing needs to be able to happen when you're in the rising trot. So your knees and ankles must be soft. Otherwise, you get to the rise and then you immediately start to fall down again because you can't absorb that little bump in the rise phase.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another cause of the double bounce. Another cause is just the rider trying too hard. So sometimes they might just be rising too high out of the saddle and they're not allowing the horse to push them out of the saddle. So sometimes that's just about trying to feel what's going on underneath you. Just stand up as high as the horse pushes you, which might not be very high, and then control the downward movement. You don't have to stand all the way up every time. So correcting those faults, there's a few ways to correct them. It's helpful in halt to just double check again on the rider's leg position and their body and pelvis angle.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I've even, if you hold the rider's legs in the correct position, if their legs are tending to shoot forward, then hold their legs back and get them to rise. They can actually feel how much more balanced they can rise with the legs further back. This is on the simulator, obviously.
Yep.
Once they've got a feel for it, they can then replicate that. So that's a helpful thing that you can do.
Yes.
But even on a horse, you can do that in the halt to make sure everything's in the right place and everything's balanced while they're stationary.
If you're an equestrian coach or a horse riding instructor, or even if you aspire to be one, have a look at the free video series for horse riding instructors on the Horse Chats website. Go there now, have a look, horsechats.com.
Especially thinking about beginner riders, they get on there, they sit down like it's a lounge chair, they struggle with the trot, their legs are too far forward, so they've got to lean far too far forward to compensate.
Yeah.
Then they try and get themselves out of the saddle, and if you've allowed them to have the reins, they're pulling on the horse's mouth, but if you haven't allowed them, the elbows come out or they grab the mane because they're not balanced, whereas, what you're saying is just make sure that they're balanced in the trot before they even start to rise.
Yeah. And this is all the coach's responsibility, and we owe that to the horse and the rider, because we do often, some people will just expect the rider to get on and know how to sit and know how to move. And sometimes even when they're making corrections, the rider doesn't really understand what they mean. So it's really, really important at the basic level just to stay balanced within the rising trot.
Okay, we can go on to point number 8 now, which is absorbing movement in the canter. Can you tell us a bit about how the body changes and what needs to happen for the rider to absorb the movement in the canter?
So the canter's a little bit different, and if you watch a really good rider cantering, you can see that the hips move in a backward circle, forward, up, back and down. The up part of the circle synchronizes with the suspension phase of the canter. The most active part of that circle is the up part, which is created by a lift from tensing the buttocks. And then you need to immediately release that tension and allow your lower back to flex so that the pelvis goes to the back and down part of the circle. There's also a slight lateral movement towards the leading leg during the up phase, and that's created naturally by having the outside hip slightly further back than the inside, which enables the seat to go up towards the leading leg.
Okay.
So that's canter movement.
While you're talking, I'm going, yeah, right. And I even had my hip in the right place when you're talking about the leading leg. So good.
Oh,
no,
great.
I think that's good. I think your explanations are really good because they're quite detailed and subtle, but it's enough to separate that, you can sort of think about each different movement as we're going through it. Now, talk about common faults in the canter and how to correct them.
Okay, well, if you can imagine, one of the most common faults is the seat popping out of the back of the saddle. So the rider doesn't quite stay in the saddle, and they're generally leaning a little bit too far forward, and they're not allowing the lower back to flex enough for the down and back part of the circle. And a more serious fault is the polishing of the saddle, which is where the seat scrubs forward and back, but there's no lift. And that means that the horse can't really lift their back and can't go very well into the suspension phase of the canter, so it tends to make the canter quite flat. The polishing the saddle is caused by leaning back or by some people even purposely exaggerating the forward and back movement. And some people are not creating that lift, so the circle's not going up, and that's because they're not tensing their buttocks and engaging the core. Both of those faults that I've talked about, the popping out of the seat at the back and the polishing the saddle, are very hard to correct on a horse. And that's because most horses can't maintain a balanced canter for long enough to help the rider, particularly at the level where I'm mostly teaching. So there are solutions though. You can practice your hip circles on a gym ball, and the gym ball will bounce correctly if you get your timings right. There's quite an important timing element to absorbing the movement in the canter, because you tense your buttocks momentarily to cause the lift, and then you need to release that tension immediately and allow your weight to fall down again for the back and down phase circle. Most people, when they try this for the first time, myself included, can't release the tension quickly enough. Or you can release the tension once and then you do it again and then you can't release it, because it's not really a movement that you're particularly used to doing, and you need to train your body to do that. So if you sit in front of the TV on a gym ball and practice to begin with just tensing and releasing in time with the bounce of the gym ball, and you create that lift with your tension and then you release, eventually you can train your muscles to do that. And once you've got that aspect, the rest of the circle is fairly easy. In fact, the horse pretty much causes that to happen themselves. And that will make a really big difference to how still you're able to keep your legs, how well you're able to stay with the horse in the canter, and how free the horse's canter is able to be. So it can even help towards improving the horse's canter as well as your own riding, and you'll look a lot stiller on the horse.
I was going to say the exercises, that you're saying with the gym balls, it's sort of something that you can do. So, it's dark and your horse has been worked for the day and you want to get more riding in, but you've only got one horse to ride or two horses to ride, and you want to do more in your spare time. And that picking up a gym ball, it's just, it's another one of those exercises that you can do to improve your riding, but while you're not riding.
Yes, and that's actually extremely important to find opportunities for doing that. And even if it's just visualization, because the amount of time you spend on a horse, often it's not really quality time spent focusing on your position, because you're trying to get the horse to do things.
Sure.
So the amount of time we get to spend on a horse practicing our position is very, very limited. And that's, that's one of the reasons why I got the simulator for myself as well, because I spend a long time practicing and correcting my own riding on the simulator and just getting it really into my muscle memory. But if you don't have a simulator, there's other ways that you can do that. Even if you're driving along in the car, you can practice the tensing of the buttocks and the release.
I was going to say, if you're driving though, let's practice it when you're just still first before you start. Don't go down the highway and start practicing that.
Well, that's true. I don't want to be responsible for causing an accident.
When you're sitting in the car without the engine on.
With your posture as well. When I first get in the car, and this is generally good, but when I first get in the car, I just make sure my shoulder blades are flat.
Yep.
And that's when I work on my posture. And I also work on my softness of my elbows and wrists, because that's good for driving as well. It's good to not grip the steering wheel really, really hard, but to have a firm but gentle grip on the steering wheel. So that's another opportunity where you can practice those things.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, obviously never compromising your safety with driving. But
Okay. Now, we've got point number 10, which is putting it all into practice. But before we do point number 10, can I just quickly go through the previous 9 points, and you interrupt if you think that there's anything extra that you need to cover, and then we'll finish off with point number 10. So the first one is the balanced position at the halt, getting that established first. The next one is absorbing movement in the walk, then correcting the faults within the walk. Then we talked about the sitting trot, so absorbing the movements in the sitting trot and then correcting any faults in the sitting trot. Then we went on to the rising trot and absorbing the movement there, correcting the faults in the rising trot, absorbing the movement in the canter and correcting the faults in the canter. So we've sort of gone through the paces, the different ways to ride the paces like sitting trot, rising trot. But if we can go to point number 10 now, which is putting it all into practice and setting ourselves up for success. If you can talk to us about that, that would be brilliant.
Oh, hang on a sec. Let me interrupt to let people know about the horse industry qualifications at onlinehorsecollege.com. If you have a look at the flexible options, there's online theory, and the practical components can be completed by video or with a qualified expert in your area. That website again is onlinehorsecollege.com. Okay, thanks.
yeah, okay. So putting it into practice, Obviously, it's really important to have all the theory work there and to do everything you can to, have a coach correct you and to find out what's causing those faults. And also to understand, technically speaking, how the horse moves and how that moves your body. That's all really important. But we start to come into difficulties based on what's limiting us. So a lot of people, especially novice riders or even recreational riders who may not be novice, they may be quite good riders, but they have a horse which they bought based on its temperament and its quietness, but it's not necessarily a very highly trained horse. It's not necessarily moving in a very balanced way. That doesn't mean that they need to sell the horse and buy themselves a schoolmaster. There's ways that you can deal with that situation without having to do that. And one of the important things for me with your horse is to slow things down and to get things right at a slower pace first. So you can do a lot to, even if your trot and canter aren't very good, you could do a lot to improve your horse's balance by doing lateral work in the walk, which can be taught to anybody. It's all just about timing and balance. So lateral work in the walk, rein back, and halt transitions will immediately improve your horse's balance in the walk. Once you've got a balanced walk, you can then work on your walk-trot transitions. And if you begin with walk-trot-walk, you'll generally go from a balanced walk naturally into a fairly balanced trot. And as long as you keep the time period of the trot very slow, then you can maintain that. So you can gradually learn to synchronize with the movement and maintain the balance in that way. Mm-hmm. And, from that, you gradually build duration. You'll also find that if you introduce canter a lot later, once you've established your lateral work in trot, that the first transition to canter will be much, much more balanced. Mm-hmm. And you won't have all these problems with running into canter, taking off on the wrong lead, and then often people will be in canter on the forehand and they'll be trying to correct it by maintaining the canter. If you can set up a good canter by having the horse very balanced in and established in walk and trot, then you don't have to go through all of that, and it's much better for the horse and it's much better for the rider. So you've got to be creative about working with what you've got and setting yourself up for success. And I would always urge people, if you find yourself bouncing or out of sync with a horse, come back to walk and start again, because nothing is gained. And I know the way that I trained with the BHS, we had to go round in a fairly fast trot with no stirrups for hours and hours. Well, it felt like hours. It probably wasn't. But we got a good seat eventually, but that was probably to the detriment of the horse, because the horse had to deal with a whole lot of bouncing in order for us to get there. But I now believe that's not necessary, and it's not really ethical for the sake of the horse or the rider. It may get the results and it may work for some people, but I think you can be creative about it. You should put the horse's comfort first at all times, and you'll get a much more rewarding journey by doing it that way. Yep. It doesn't have to be no pain, no gain. It can be, use your brain, use your creativity, and use your feel to think, does this feel good? If it doesn't, how else could I try to do it? So there's lots of ways of dealing with the problems that we face. It doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It doesn't have to be, that horse isn't suitable, you need a more educated horse. We can work with it, and especially if you get the guidance of a good coach, you can work with what you've got. Yep. The other thing, though, that I think is really important is the saddle balance. And it's quite hard because I'm not the sort of person that wants to try to push people into spending a lot of money buying, or you've got to buy a new saddle. But I do feel that if you do have, the spare money to spend, it's really worth investing in a good saddle. Because if your saddle is balancing you and putting you in the right position, then you're not fighting it, and it's really setting you up for success. It's also really helping the horse, because if the saddle can help to put you in a balanced position, then you're not hurting the horse and you're not bouncing on the horse. It just cuts out a lot of the early on problems that we have. So I actually, from riding a lot on riding school horses in GP saddles, I've learned to sort of pull the stirrup bar back, and that's what I still do when I get on. So I tend to often even ride with my legs too far back now because I'm riding in better saddles. But generally speaking, the stirrup bars, even on dressage saddles, are often too far forward. And so the rider is fighting them all the time, which is what I did, to get your leg in the right position. And if you're fighting the saddle, then that's energy that you could be putting in much more productive areas. So when you're sitting on the saddle, well, if you look at the saddle on the horse, the deepest part of the saddle should be horizontal, not tipped back or forward. And if you're sitting on the horse with your correct shoulder, hip, heel line, the stirrup leathers should be vertical. They shouldn't be pulled forwards. So if you can get those two things right with your saddle, then that will help you a huge amount and enable you to move on with your riding. And I just think that alongside being a really good fit for the horse are really good ways to set yourself up and to set yourself on the right track.
Yeah, about the saddle, it doesn't mean you've got to go out and buy a new saddle, latest, everything else. Look around. If you are on a budget, have a look around and see if you can pick up a good second-hand saddle rather than, you can often pick up a better second-hand saddle for the budget that you've got than going out and buying a brand new saddle.
Yes, and it's also important though, because I've had clients who I've pointed this out to and they've gone and bought a new saddle, but it's actually no better than the old one. It's important to make sure to do those checks that I've told you about and just make sure that you've got that levelness and the correct placement of the stirrup bar. I'm not trying to plug here, but I personally recommend the Heather Moffat saddles, and she does a synthetic version, which is affordable. And that's what I would recommend personally. But, like you say, you can look around. It doesn't have to be a leather saddle. It doesn't have to be fancy. But, the positioning of the stirrup bars is very important.
Yep. All right, Diana, thanks very much for all of your insights there onto the 10 ways to improve your riding, a biomechanical approach. And if you're anything like me, and even though I've said to you, go and listen to 016, but you kept going with this podcast, remember to go back, listen to 016 at some time so you can find a little bit more about Diana, what she does, and why she's got the expertise to go ahead and talk about ways to improving your riding. And I think we've gone through those 10 points. Those 10 points will be summarised as well on horsechats.com/Diana Waters. And also too, if you go in and actually it'll be Diana Waters too. If you go into horsechats.com and just search for Diana, you'll find it. And it's Diana with one N. And Diana, your contact details, if you'd like to say them again, and they'll also be on horsechats.com/Diana Waters too.
Yes, well, all my contact details are on my website, which is responsiveequine.com.au.
Yep.
I also wanted to add a final word, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just about I just wanted to say that there's often a temptation to increase the strength of your aids, so to add whip or to add spur if something's not working. And I actually don't think there's ever a need for this. I feel really strongly that if you fix your position and your synchronization with the movement, and if you fix your timing of the aids, the application and the release of the aids, then you never need to increase those aids. And I believe that everyone at all levels can ride beautifully if they're shown how to do this. And I think that's what everybody should be aiming for. It's not just for the elite riders. So, I just wanted to say that.
All right. Thanks, Diana. And hopefully you'll come back with some more of your educational knowledge. Come back another time, and we look forward to seeing that. And thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, if you're still there, you probably know that I'm absolutely passionate about education within the horse industry. That's why I host this podcast. My other venture is Online Horse College. Have a look now at onlinehorsecollege.com and I'll see you over there.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.